So for days, Jesus and his disciples met secretly outside of Jerusalem, planning for Operation Sacred Vengeance, planning where the weapons would be stored, the horses would be waiting, the militia would assemble. They also organized the crowds and all the collaborators in Jerusalem who would hit the streets at just the right moment to intimidate and distract the Romans and to put the fear of God in them. Finally, after all the planning, the day came. And Jesus, mounted on a white horse, carrying a huge sword hidden in a palm branch, and the disciples armed with swords, daggers, and shields camouflaged behind palm branches, mounted on war horses prepared for battle. Then word went out to the crowds to assemble, and men came out of the woodwork, also camouflaged and ready to fight, and young men and boys carried concealed torches ready to fight, marching on the city to create mayhem all throughout Jerusalem. And the battle began. Hosanna, the people shouted. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord to execute vengeance on our enemies. And word spread, and people streamed from the city to welcome the freedom fighters as they crossed over the hill near Bethany, and the city of Jerusalem came into view. And it was there that Jesus gave a rousing speech. He said, "It is wrong for the heathen idolaters to have power over the faithful people of God. And that wrong will end today. We have suffered enough. Now we will make our persecutors suffer." And the people were cheering and chanting, "Victory, victory, crush the Romans, kill the collaborators." "Who is with me," Jesus asked, "in our holy cause?" And the crowd shouted, "We are, we are." The voice echoing through the valley and into the streets of Jerusalem. Who is willing to fight to the death to avenge the blood of our ancestors? And again the crowd chanted, "We are, we are." And who will shed a gallon of Roman blood for every drop of our blood that is shed? And again the crowd erupted with applause. And then Jesus asked defiantly, "Are we trying to be Goliath or are we trying to be David? Those who live by restraint will die by restraint. Now is the time, now is the day for the annihilation of our enemies." And now the branches and coats were thrown to the ground, and blades glistened in the sun, and the great battle for Jerusalem began. A battle we remember every Palm Sunday. The day that Jesus conquered the Roman Empire once and for all. I hope you realize by now, this isn't the story. This is not what happened. Even though this scene has played out time and time again throughout human history, as generation after generation argues that the ends justify the means and have used violence to justify the ends. The most consistent storyline in human history. Despite the evidence, despite the fact that it has not produced enduring freedom or enduring victory, the most famous storyline. It's also the most popular storyline in Hollywood, where movie after movie trains us to believe that violence can lead to just outcomes. The myth of redemptive violence, which Walter Wink speaks so powerfully and prophetically about. The argument that victory over chaos by means of violence is the way that makes the most sense. The ideology of conquest, which is the religion of the status quo. An ideology, he writes, which prefers any form of order to chaos, promoting peace through war and security through strength. And sadly, rather than undermine and challenge this myth at every turn, too often religion and Christianity has legitimized it, even celebrated it, glorified it. So I guess it shouldn't surprise us that we have read and interpreted the book of Revelation through this very lens, pointing to texts like the one Jim just read to argue that at the end times, Jesus will return to destroy all his enemies on a white horse with a bloody robe, sword in hand, prepared for battle, despite the fact that it contradicts everything else he ever said or taught or did, suggesting that in the end, Jesus is not consistent, and that in fact he turns his back on his very message and takes up the very sword that he told Peter to put away. But here's the truth. Here's the good news. This is the very opposite of what Jesus did. And if we look closely at the text, we see it even in this text in the book of Revelation. Yeah, the robe is bloodied, but did you notice the robe is bloodied before the battle begins? It's been bloodied through the sacrificial love of Jesus, who dies on a cross to show us what we're doing to ourselves and to each other and to the planet that we've been entrusted with. Yeah, he's got a sword, but notice it's not in his hand. It comes out of his mouth. A powerful reminder that his word, his way, his truth, his life will triumph in the end. And instead of the sword on his thigh where all the warriors kept it, inscribed on his thigh are these words: King of Kings, Lord of Lords. This vision unveils a different kind of king than what we want, than what we expect. And the same dynamic is happening on Palm Sunday, and this is just an x-ray of what happened on Palm Sunday, where Jesus chooses not to take up arms, as many hoped, but chose instead to fight through nonviolent love and resistance, demonstrating, as John the Revelator has been doing throughout the book, that God is not like a ferocious lion accomplishing his will by destroying all of his enemies. No. God is like a lamb, a bloodied lamb, who takes upon himself the sin of the world and the hurt of the world and conquers through enduring suffering. Today's great battle is an x-ray, unveiling what actually we believe happened during Holy Week, when Jesus mysteriously comes into Jerusalem, the heart of the empire, and takes care of evil once and for all, and shows us all evil's true color. And by dying on a cross and rising in glory, reveals the powerlessness of sin and death and the power of a better way, the power of love and truth. And the sacrificial love of Jesus, the Lamb of God, bloodied by our sin, in the end, will triumph over all. That's the big message. And this story, the second text, points right to the heart of it. In the first text, we're introduced to another powerful force, which is conditioning us to believe in the power of violence. It's the seductive whore of Babylon, who is in bed with powerful kings, who has made a toxic brew that makes the world drunk and is drinking the blood of the witnesses or the martyrs. Now, it's worth noting that she is the whore of Babylon. And who are the Babylonians? Any first century reader would have understood that they are the ones who destroyed the Jewish temple in 586 BC. Most people believe that Babylon was probably a code for Rome or for all empires, and interestingly, Rome would be the second people who would destroy the Jewish temple. The Babylonians and the Romans were violent people who tried to force people to worship their gods and persecuted people of faith. Now, the whore, scholars argue, is not the type who is forced into prostitution by economic conditions and such, but rather somebody who is playing the system, looking to make a quick buck, different kind of whore. She represents the seductive power of materialism. She is clothed with all of this gold, and she represents materialism which has separated matter from spirit and is its own form of violence, whose devastating effects may not be as obvious as guns and tanks and bombs, but is no less real. For as materialism runs amok in our world, it threatens the future of the life of our planet, no less violent than guns and tanks and bombs. But it does more than just destroy the environment. Materialism destroys relationship, human relationship, particularly the relationship between the rich and the poor. Because when you marry hyper-materialism with hyper-individualism, which is, I think, what we've got today, you've got a toxic brew that has become unmoored from social responsibility and social accountability. And the conditions have been created where the economy, which literally means the household of God, the economy, which ought to work for the whole household, works increasingly better for the rich and powerful and increasingly worse for the poor and vulnerable. The image of the great whore would have been very familiar to the first century because throughout the text, the Jews were understood themselves to be God's bride. And the early Christians were believed to be wed to Christ. And throughout the text, we see God lamenting over and over again as the people of faith lose their way and as they choose power and violence and economic security. Time and time again, God laments the whoring of the people of faith as they turn to these other gods. And the whore seduces people to worship the gods of economic power and military force. Eugene Peterson writes this about the worship that the great whore is inviting us to. He says, "It is the commercialization of our great need and deep desire for meaning, love, and salvation, for the completion of ourselves from beyond ourselves. Whore worship thrives," he says, "by naming the worst things about us, our pride, our lust, our greed, our envy, and our anger, with the designation God. Whore worship thrives by gathering depersonalized and depersonalizing crowds to religiously pursue these divinized defects." I realize these are big words. I'm going to read that again. Whore worship thrives by naming the worst things about us and basically saying these things are gods: envy, pride, lust, anger. And then it gathers and mobilizes people who are depersonalized, disconnected from their humanity, and who together create an inhuman mob. And it mobilizes them, it energizes them to pursue these things that are in fact not God. The book of Revelation is asking throughout the text, who are you worshiping? And the premise here is that we are all worshiping something. An atheist who may not worship God and believe in God, I promise you, worships something. We all worship something. Even those of us who profess ourselves as Christians are worshiping something. And sometimes it's not Christ, it's something else. So the question isn't whether we worship, the question is who are we worshiping, what are we worshiping? And the two most seductive gods in our culture are violence and materialism. And it is our allegiance to these gods that keep us from worshiping the one true God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Artist and author Christine Walters Painter uses a simple example to demonstrate just how insidious and seductive these gods are in our culture today. And she looks at the language that we use, which is a lot more possessive and aggressive than maybe we might realize at first look. And she uses the example of, quote, taking pictures. Now, it's worth noting that many cultures don't take pictures because they feel like it's a robbery. My brother, when he came from Vietnam in the late 70s, would not want to be in a picture because he was taught that it was stealing somebody's soul, and he believed that image could be used in ways that were not honorable. There's some truth there, right? But the word taking pictures is actually a betrayal of what actually happens with a person taking photography. Because in photography, the light is reflected off of the subject and received by the camera through the opening of a lens. So we don't really take anything at all. We receive the image as a gift. And so any good photographer understands that their job is to wait and see for the gift to be offered, to see what shows up in the image that they're given. As the most faithful among us learn to receive everything as a gift from the hand of God. But you see what materialism does? It conditions us to be acquisitive, grabby, graspy, reaching for things, taking things as if they belonged to us. Do you see the energy of what we're all being conditioned to do? And do you see how it works against the posture of genuine faith, which is to receive it all from the hand of God? While the gods of materialism and violence are mainstreamed in our culture, are worshiped readily, and seem all-powerfully, they are actually counterfeit gods. They're idols because they undermine our deeper needs and desires, and they don't deliver on their promise. And our deepest needs and desires can only be met by the generous, nonviolent love of God. That's what our human soul longs for. That's what the faithful are opening themselves to receive. And I think it is a failure of Christianity that the way of nonviolent love is not at the heart of our teaching, not at the heart of our practice, the heart of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, when it is so abundantly clear that that is what he has been teaching us. Now, this story that I'm going to share is admittedly a simple example, but I think it gives us a little window into how we're called to live in the world. A woman was driving with her husband and kids in a minivan when she was cut off by an aggressive driver. She was so upset with this driver that she honked at him, flipped him, and yelled out, "Where are the cops when you need them?" And then, much to her husband's surprise, she announced she was going to follow the driver. So she started to trail him, and she pulled right up on his rear, and the driver tried to evade her until they both came to a long stoplight, at which point she grabbed something from the front seat divider, opened up her door, and she said, "Now he's going to be sorry." And she jumped out of the car, pounded on his window, and yelled, "If you could do something that mean to another person, you need this." And she flung something in the window before she returned to her car, triumphant and glorious. Her husband asked, "What did you throw in there?" But she wasn't ready to talk. And then all of a sudden the light turned green and she didn't move. And thankfully there was no one honking behind her. And the other guy didn't move until finally he began to move very slowly. And if a car could look ashamed, this car was ashamed. And finally the husband asked again, "So what did you throw in there? Tell me." She said, "I threw in a grape lollipop. And I said to him, 'You're such a mean, awful human being that something must have gone really wrong in your childhood, and maybe this lollipop will help correct that just a little.'" How different is that from what the Apostle Paul told the church of Rome? Think of how bold that is. "Do not repay anyone evil for evil," he said, "but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. If they cut you off on a road, give them a grape lollipop. For by doing this, you will be heaping burning coals on their heads. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." I know that sounds so impractical. I know it might even feel immoral to not respond in kind, but is it possible that God knows something that we don't? Is it possible that Jesus has our best intentions and the best intentions of all the people that he loves at heart? Is it possible that they know that nothing is powerful enough to change anything fundamentally except the nonviolent love of God? Not economic force, military power, who, like the whore of Babylon, seem to be all-powerful today and always, but do they really change things fundamentally? Do they really deliver on their promises? No doubt the whore of Babylon and the whore of empire is seductive, and there are countless examples of people getting drunk on these gods, mocking anybody else who will do something different. No doubt following the way of Jesus is repulsive to our ego and seems utterly foolish. No doubt that following the way of Jesus will always be a movement that contradicts the mainstream and moves against the status quo. And no doubt it will never satisfy our brain, because we now know neuroscience says we prefer a simple lie to a complex truth. But John the Revelator is telling the truth. He's saying quite clearly that if we walk this path, we will be bloodied just like the Lamb, just like the rider called faithful and true. And we will be taking up the only sword that Jesus ever took up, and we will fight with that sword, not in our hands, but through the truth of our witness. And we will be citizens not of this world. In fact, we will be unrecognizable to our brothers and sisters, but we will be citizens of another world. And we will not be in the bed with the whore of empire, but we will be wed and faithful to Christ, who is faithful to us, who is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and whose nonviolent love will triumph in the end. Amen.